Hi everyone, my name is Melanie Grant and this is C&M Glass. Today's focus is going to be on ICD-10 CM coding for external causes of morbidity, Chapter 20 of your ICD-10 CM code book, which covers codes from V00 through Y99. We're going to be looking at key points of external causes, kind of identifying when we use them, what their purpose is, as well as how to sequence them, and the different types of external causes that you'll find within this coding chapter. For this video, I'm going to be using our ICD-10 2019 edition from the AAPC Expert Edition. And I'll also be referencing some materials from Chapter 16, Section 1 of the Let's Code It 2019 textbook. All right, so let's get started. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about is what is external causes and what is their purpose for reporting. So your key word with this one today is that we use external causes for information about reporting when patients are injured or have other various different types of ailments, or in this case, morbidity, where we need to identify how these things happen. A lot of times you'll see statistics that talk about how often certain individuals of certain age groups are injured in certain activities. And this is exactly where they find this information out. Now, before we get started, it's important to note that not every insurance company wants to see or will require to see all the external causes, while others may. Your office may end up saying that you don't need to report all external causes, while others may. And in all actuality, they're not always required, but for correct coding purposes, we should know how to report them and when to report them. And when we're talking about coding, we want to always be accurate in the sense that everything that applies as it should be applicable is reported. So the purpose, and I'm going to read this directly from our ICD-10 CM Chapter 21 under the notes that are listed for you, because I think this is really important to understand. This chapter permits the classification of environmental events and circumstances where the case of injury and other adverse effects. Where a code from this section is applicable, it is intended that it shall be used secondary to a code from another chapter of the classification indicating the nature of the condition. Most often the condition will be classifiable to Chapter 19, Injury, Poisoning, and Other Certain Consequences of External Causes, codes S00 through T88. So I'm going to stop there. Now, what that's basically saying to you is when you have an injury or some sort of traumatic impact on the body, a patient is going to have reasons for that injury. Things that are going to identify the cause for how they were injured, whether it was an accident from a motor vehicle, whether they fell down a flight of stairs, or whether they were pecked in the head by a parrot at the zoo. Whatever the cause of the injury, we're going to have first the injury code. So, and it may not always be an injury code, so injury or problem, we'll say. That is your primary. Then we're going to list some of these external causes. We're going to say, first, how they were injured. And in some cases where a patient, for example, has conditions that are caused by work environments, it's an injury to a disease such as black lung, where you won't have an injury code, you'll have a condition, but you'll still have the how it happened. Okay, so this is where the next part says some conditions may be stated due to external causes and classified throughout ICD-10 CM, chapters 1 through 18, basically the entire book. So what they're saying is most of the time the how is going to be talking about an injury, but sometimes may talk about how they obtained a condition that they would not have otherwise had they not been exposed to something. Okay, so that's your first type of external coding is the cause. What was the cause for this particular condition, injury, or problem that the patient has? Then we talk about where it happened, and this is not always something that we can list. So it depends on what's documented. When we talk about location, we're talking about did it happen at home? Did it happen at a grocery store? Did it happen when they were at work? And if so, what type of work environment was it? Did it happen while they were at a park? While they were at the zoo? All this information that you'll find within the note. This is called a place of occurrence and will be looked up in your external cause index as place for place of occurrence. Also, we like to know what type of, location of injury or condition when it was exposed, and then activity, what were they doing? So we have our how, where, and what. What were they doing? Okay, so activity is talking about if somebody's injured in an accident from a sport of some sort, we want to know about that sport. This all goes into reporting information, and it makes for some really cool statistical types of information. Not that the injury itself is cool, but it gives us information about what's higher risk. How many people actually die from injuries or can get injured doing certain types of sports? And so I mentioned sports. It's not always a sport that they were doing. But whatever the case is, whatever they were doing, this information is collected so that we can provide information to society and do our public service. So when you think about external cause codes, that's what we're doing here. The last one is the status. And when we talk about status, we look at what they were doing when they were injured, where they were at, and we say, was it something that they were choosing to do? Or was it something that they were getting paid to do? Were they doing this as a military or non-civilian? And so status is talking about why they were doing it. And so we have status such as recreational, and we have status such as military and work. And so all of that information goes in here. Now, there are a couple of things that you're not going to know the information, and when it's required to be reported, there's also some unknowns. So unknown, and you want to remember anytime you have unknown or not otherwise specified, you're going to identify that this isn't information anywhere within the note, and typically you're going to list this as when it's appropriate. So we have the following blocks all the way from V100 through Y99. We go from accidents, including transports, pedestrians. Remember, transport is another term for motor vehicle or transportation. So they may be on a bus, they may be in a plane, various types of transports. You have pedal cycle or bicycles. They say pedal because it's not always two-wheeled. You have motorcycles. You have occupants that are injured. So again, going into the various different types of transportation, they want to know which person in the vehicle, if your patient's the driver or an occupant, bus occupants. There's land transportation accidents. So if you think about patients who are transporting over land, I know sometimes people can be riding on some of those motorbikes and they can get injured there. And then there's other external cases of accidental injuries. So if it doesn't fall anywhere else, we go to other if it's specified. There's slipping, tripping, stumbling, and falls, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Exposures, so think about exposures for a minute. We'll take a pause. We learned about exposures when we talked about Z codes. Okay, and we said exposure to a chemical or a drug or a substance. When we talk about Z codes, we want to remember that Z codes are identified when there is not an injury or an accident that is causing harm or a condition. In the case where a patient has exposure from an external factor, this is external causes of morbidity. And so you want to remember the difference in exposure here is that there actually is a problem, that it's not just the fact that they were exposed. And so if they are exposed to something but there was no injury, you're going to fall under those Z codes. But if there was an injury or condition of some sort, you're going to come here. After our exposure, we have overexertion, which is something we'll see a lot in New Mexico with our heat strokes, accidental exposures, assaults, intentional self-harm, so attempted suicide falls under that category when it's not completed, undetermined intents, legal interventions such as operations of war, military operations, and terrorism. So if somebody is injured during a legal intervention, there's codes for that. If there's complications in medical and surgical care, misadventures to patients during surgical and medical care, medical devices associated with adverse incidences and diagnostic and therapeutic use, so if a device is causing them injury, surgical and other medical procedures as the cause of an abnormal reaction or later complication without the mention of it being a misadventure at the time. And then you have just your supplementary factors that cause of morbidity classified elsewhere. So there's a lot of blocks here. Anybody's head just kind of swim. That's okay. So I'm on page 1187 of my ICD-10 CM code book. And I can read all of these in the very front of chapter 20 of the coding chapter, where it talks about external causes of morbidity. And this is where I find my blocks. This is where I find my information. Now, before we start coding in this chapter, we also want to take note that all of your external causes of morbidity will be found in its own separate alphabetical index in the very front, which is actually at the end of your regular index. So in the very beginning of our ICD-10 CM book, we have our guidelines and all of our various information, anatomical information if your book has it, and then we have our alphabetical index. And at the end of the alphabetical index, you'll often find a neoplasm table, followed by a table of drugs and chemicals, followed by the external causes of injury. And that's going to be the last alphabetical index that's before the actual tabular section. So when I'm looking in here, I want to make sure I'm in the alphabetical index, and it'll say on the side, ICD-10-CM index to external causes and injuries, versus my normal alphabetical, which just says ICD-10-CM index to diseases and injuries. So there's two different alphabeticals there. I want to make sure I'm in the right one. Once I'm in here, I'm going to think about various different key terms. What are my main terms? What is the problem with the patient? Keep in mind some of your major ones. A lot of your terms will fall under the term accident. So if you think about they were in a car crash, you're going to go under accident, motor vehicle, or transport. If they fell down the stairs, fall is the actual problem. That's the external cause. The stairs themselves weren't the cause of their injury, although it may have caused them to fall, but the fall itself is what caused the injury. And then we have things like bites, like being pecked at the zoo by a bird. That is technically a bite. Okay, so you want to think about different terminology here. That's going to help you. When you're looking for place of occurrence, you're going to look for the term place. And then there's also some sequela of, which we'll talk more in depth when we go over chapter 19, when we talk about injuries and what is a sequela. But there's often times where an injury or an external cause is, the injury is after the fact, where the original injury didn't seem like it was a problem, and now there's a problem as a result of that. And so as a result of an injury from a month ago, there's a sequela of this external cause. And so that means late effect. It happened later on. Okay, so our chapter reading is very small. It doesn't give us a lot of detail. However, you'll find a lot of information about guidelines and how to use these codes in some of the videos I provided in my classroom. So for this video, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about how we would list these codes. Now, in sequencing, as I mentioned previously, you always want the condition or the injury to be primary. And so you'll find a code based off of the type of injury or condition, and that's going to be listed with either initial visit, subsequent, or sequela if it's an injury code. And if it's a condition code, it may or may not have those options. Now, when we talk about initial, subsequent, and sequela, we're talking about, is this the first time they're being seen for this? And are they in the initial stage of treatment? So are we still trying to figure out how best to treat it? Subsequent is while they're healing. And so we're no longer trying to do treatment. We've already started treatment, and it's no longer a question of what to do for treatment. So that's your subsequent visits. And then after they are completely healed, if there's a late effect, we go into that sequela. So we have here an example. Dr. Dellin diagnosed Phyllis with an inferior dislocation of the humerus of the right side. For this one, because this was, oh, here's the full description. Phyllis, a 27-year-old female, was learning how to rock climb at her gym. As she was scaling the wall, her foot slipped and Phyllis grabbed on with her right hand. She pulled something in her shoulder. Severe pain caused her to stop by her physician's office on the way home. They took x-rays and determined there was an inferior dislocation of the humerus of the right side. So Dr. Dallin put her arm back into a sling and gave her a prescription for pain. Okay, so the first thing we have is we have a dislocation, which is an injury. And I'm going to give you that code because we're not coding from injuries at the moment. So the dislocation of the humerus is going to be S43.00, nope, I'm sorry, S43.034A. Okay, so that's the code that they've given us. And if you have the Let's Code It book, you can look along and see how they came up with that. The things that we want to look at is identifying what is the cause, what is the location, the activity, and status. Okay, so if we go back to our note, we say she was learning to rock climb at her gym. So that's an activity. So we have cause, location, activity, and status. Okay, and so she was learning to rock climb. As she scaled the wall, her foot slipped. She grabbed on her wall with her right hand and pulled something in her shoulder. Okay, so we want to say that, first of all, she was wall climbing. Okay, so this is going to be your cause, wall climbing, or rock climbing, because that's what it says. And she slipped. Where was she located? She was at the gym. She was involved in an activity, which is kind of the same thing here. So we want to say, again, that she was rock climbing. Let's see, as far as her status, it did not indicate to us that she was doing this for money or anything for job related. So she was doing this for fun, or in this case, as a hobby. Okay? So let's look in our external causes of injuries and see if we can find these. First, we want to look at the cause, which was an accident where she was rock climbing. Okay, so we're going to look for climbing or wall climbing, rock climbing. Keep all of those in mind. I like to look under accident first because it's the first letter of the alphabet and it tends to be the most detailed. Okay, it's one of the largest sections. Okay, so as I'm in here, now keep in mind you have accidents and then you have accidents caused by or due to, so you can look under that as well. Anytime you come across a sub-branch of a term and it seems like it could apply, it's good to read through that. Okay, so you know it was an accident caused while wall climbing. It wasn't so much the wall climbing itself, just a slip up. They did not use the word slip, so we can't go under fall. Okay, and I'm just reading down here. And I don't see climbing anywhere, so I'm going to keep going past accident. There's a lot of accidents. I'm just going to let you know. There's also activities. Okay, so as I'm coming to activity, I want to make that a note in my head because we're going to be coming there. And I'm going to go just to climbing now. Okay. So I don't see it under climbing. I did find it here under activity. So now that I found it, I have activity, climbing, and I'm on page 421. There's not elsewhere classified, but it is classified according to the breakdown. So they have mountain, rock, and wall, and you want to say what was she climbing? Was she climbing a rock or a wall? She was learning to rock climb at her gym, and I don't believe she was on a wall. But if you look at the difference for rock and wall, it's Y93.31. And so when you see that, sometimes it's good to say, well, I'm not sure if it was a rock wall or if it's a wall. What's the difference? And you can see that the codes are actually the same, meaning that both descriptions identify the same type of climbing. So we're going to go with Y93.31, and I'm going to look that up in my tabular before I write it out. Okay? Now remember, we always look at the beginning of the chapter for any excludes notes, which there were not. Y93 falls under the block here for Y90 through Y99. So I want to go to Y90 before I look up Y93 to see if there's any specific notes or exclusions for this code. Okay, so I find that on page 1250. There is a note. These categories may be used to provide supplementary information concerning causes of morbidity and are not to be used for single condition coding. We already knew that, but that's good to read. And so we continue on to Y93. Category Y93, activity codes on page 1255 of my coding book. Activity codes does have a note indicating to me that we use this category to indicate activity of the person seeking health care for an injury or health conditions such as heart attack while shoveling snow, etc. They're also appropriate to use with external cause codes for cause and intent if identifying the activity provides additional information on the event. So what that just told me is that rock climbing, and you notice how we wrote it in both areas, that both of these are considered from Y93 as cause and intent if the cause of the accident is the activity. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and list that, say yes, okay, that makes sense. Read through the following broad activity categories, and we're just going to skip over to Y93.0.1 and so on. And you want to look at those differences. Always read up and down. For me, I know it's not walking or running. I know it's not water and watercraft, ice or snow. Involving climbing, rappelling, and jumping off, absolutely. We'll come back to that after we've glanced at the other Y93 options, and it goes on until the next page, all the way down to Y93.K and then 8 and 9. So always read up and down and make sure that something doesn't further identify your code. And there's going to be specifics listed in here such as sports, teams and groups. So if your patient was injured in a wall climbing accident as part of a sports team, then you would not be going to the one that it seems like it is. You would have to go further. So always read up and down. In this case, I've already read these, and so I'm going to say Y93.3 is correct. So I'm going to write that on my board, Y93.3. And I see here that it requires a 5th digit. So I'm going to keep reading. There is and excludes one note for any activities on hiking, jump roping, and trampoline jumping, which my patient did not have. For Y93.3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 9, I have the difference between mountain climbing, rock climbing, and wall climbing, rappelling, base jumping, bungee jumping, hang gliding, and other. And in this case, the wall climbing or rock climbing is exactly what we did. So I'm going to select Y93.31, okay? And that's my code. That tells me the cause and the activity because they're both the same. And so I've identified how this patient was injured. So I have first the dislocation, and then second, the cause and, in this case, the activity. But I'm not done yet because I also want to identify the location and what they were doing when this happened. So I'm going to go back to my external cause index, which I like to keep tabbed because it makes it a lot easier. Okay, so for my external cause index, I remember that my location is the gym, but I'm not going to start with gym. I'm going to start with the term place, meaning place of occurrence. So I'm going to just go in here and find my P's. And I swear I sing the alphabet every time I do this. So if you're doing that in your head, that's perfectly fine. My places continue over several pages, so I'm just going to scroll down looking for gym. Here they have it as gymnasium. Close enough. We'll call that a gym. And it's listed as Y92.39. We'll write this tentatively. And I'm going to do just like we did before. I'm going to go to the beginning of the chapter, find the block, go to the block, find any notes, and then go to the category of Y92 first. Now, if you're thinking like I'm thinking, this is the same block that Y93 was on, you'd be correct. And if you weren't positive, always double check. But because we've already looked at this and we know that gymnasium did not have any exclusions, I can go directly to category Y92 because I was just there at the block. And I know that there's nothing to worry about. So I'm going to go to Y92. I'll find this on page 1250, supplementary factors related to cause of morbidity elsewhere classified. These categories I do have, that's the beginning of Y90, so I did have that already, that they were not to be used as condition. And Y92 falls for place of occurrence of external cause. Well, yeah, that's what this is. The following category is used when relevant to identify place of occurrence of the external cause in conjunction with an activity code. Meaning, do not list the place if you do not also have an activity code. It should be recorded only at the initial encounter for treatment. Meaning that if they're coming in during a subsequent or sequela, we don't report these. Now, for Y92, I have the options between 0, dot 0, dot 1, dot 2, 4, and it goes on to dot 8, and then dot 9 eventually. Or no, dot 8. So I'm keeping in mind the 3.9 was listed. I have my dot 0 is for unspecified, non-institutional, private residence as the place of occurrence, and then it breaks down the type of those. So all of my dot zeros would not be listed because it's not an unspecified, non-institutional private residence. My dot ones are institutional, non-private residence as the place of occurrence. And we know this is not an institutional place, such as a home, so I'm going to keep going. And you notice how I skip over the dot 1, 1.12, dot 1.3, because none of those apply if Y92.1 does not. When I get to Y92.2, this is for schools and other institutions and public administrative areas as the place of occurrence, and it gives a couple of different examples here. Now, I don't think that a gym would be falling under a school, but it could potentially fall under a particular group of the public. So I'm going to glance through these. But in all reality, it's not going to because we have schools, religious institutes, hospitals, and so on. So we get to Y92.3, which is sports and athletic areas. So keep in mind, if they're in the gymnasium at a school, this is why it's important to read up and down, because if you had gymnasium and you got to Y92.39, that would be incorrect if it was a school gymnasium. You would want to instead go under Y92.2, okay? So when I get to Y92.3, I've already looked and made sure that none of these others apply, and you'll still want to read down. So always read up, always read down, and make sure there's no additional ones that would be more appropriate. In this case, I already have done this, so I'm going to look at Y92.3. I see that there is a fifth digit required here, and so I'm going to look at my options. 3.1, athletic court. 3.2, athletic field. 3.3 is a skating ring. 3.4 is a swimming pool, and 3.9 is other specified sports and athletic areas as the place of occurrence of the external cause. Ooh, so this is one of our others. And when we use a code for other, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. Did it apply with any of the other categories that we looked at, or subcategories? No, it did not. Is it possible it's somewhere else that we're looking? If you found this code as a direct result of an exact term, such as gymnasium, and everything you looked at did not identify it further, then you don't need to look further to say whether or not other is appropriate. If, however, you came to this code because you had no other resources or terminology was not exact, you'll want to verify that. So in this case, we're going to stay with other and say, yes, 3-9 is appropriate because there is no other option. And if we look in the little examples, gymnasium as a place of occurrence is listed as one of the others. So we can say with certainty that this is the correct code for our location. Excuse me. Okay, so we get to our last one here, which is going to be what the patient's status was. So again, I'm going to go all the way back to the very beginning of my external cause alphabetical index. And again, I like to have that tab because, gosh, it sure makes it easier. And in here, this one's going to be fairly easy because I'm just going to look in my alphabetical and I'm going to say, okay, what was their status? They were doing a fun hobby, right? So for the status, we want to look at external cause of status is hobby, not done for income. And you are going to go on page 439 of the alphabetical, and they list all of the statuses. There's a very small list of them. It's not very much. So you have a status of external causes, Y99.9, that's at the bottom of the middle column. And then you have child, civilian, family, hobby, leisure, military, off-duty, recreational, specified but not elsewhere classified, student, and voluntary activity. So if it doesn't fall under one of those, well, it's going to fall under one of those. So it's a very small list. Now for this one, we said it was a hobby. They were learning to do something, and if you look at the definition, it's a hobby not done for income. Now, I might argue and say, well, it was also a leisure activity. She was learning it for fun, or at least I would think so. And it doesn't exactly specify, so we can't assume here. The only thing we can determine from this is that she was learning to do something which is considered a hobby. When you go out and you're paying someone to teach you to do something that is not for school and is not for work or other types of statuses, then it's considered a hobby. And if you notice the code for leisure activity and hobby, both of these fall to Y99.8. Okay, so that's just a little tidbit of information. Now, notice again, we're going to start by looking up Y99, find the block first. We've already done this just like before with Y93 and Y92. We've looked at the chapter, we've looked at the block, and so we know it falls under categories that are not to be listed as primary condition. And so I'm going to go straight to category code Y99, which is going to be found on page 1257. It's not very large. External cause of status, you'll notice this is very similar. Y99.8 classifies to other external causes of status. Again, we're looking at a code that's other. And so we want to look and say, okay, we have civilian, military, volunteer, and other. Oh, gosh, darn. And then unspecified. Well, we know it was specified, so Y99.8, and that one's going to be your easiest of your external causes. Well, that's it. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 codes. And in this case, we did not have a separate one for cause and activity because they were the same and can be listed as the same when they both apply. So we have our injury or dislocation. We have what they did to cause the injury or dislocation. We have where they were when it happened, and we had their status. And so that's it for our reporting of external causes. Does it seem like a little bit of information? Yeah, it can. And it can take you a little bit of time as you're learning these. But just be patient with yourself and always remember there's multiple codes that you can list, and we can get really stuck in the weeds here. We can also have a lot of fun. So until next time, we'll talk to you soon when we talk about external causes and injuries as our next topic, looking at some of these injuries and dislocations. We'll talk to you soon.